Welcome everyone. This is the first time in quite some time that we've had a chapter meeting. I've been on the ASEA Greater Alabama chapter board for a long time. We've kind of with people's schedules getting busy, I volunteered to dive in and help out. And we are going to hold elections for the board this spring, so I'll help with getting that set up and evaluated. If you're interested in serving on the board, let me know. I'll be glad to put you on the list. And we do have a couple of local people in Huntsville that are running for the national board for the Region 3 Director, Cole Kupak and Hathel Patel. So if you're a ASEA member, be sure to put in your vote. Today I'm going to talk about my ASEA initiatives. I'm also the VP for Professional Development on the National Board. My term expires at the end of this year, but I'm going to talk about some things that we've been doing and give you some updates, and so you can see what's been going on and the things that we've accomplished lately. So, and those three things are the certification exams have moved online. We're going to have virtual conferences this year. The national workshops are going to be virtual, and we're also developing a software cost estimating body of knowledge that is a specialty body of knowledge that complements the cost estimating body of knowledge. It's not completely standalone in the sense that if you don't know anything about cost, you can just go out and study SCIBOC. You also need to have some grounding in CBOC. So we'll go through those. So the online certification exams, you can now both take the PCEA and CCA exams online. You can also take them on demand, so you don't have to wait for the schedule to come around or go to the conference or workshop to take it. There's no physical workshop to go to this year anyway, but so this has actually worked out pretty well for us in the year of the pandemic. We were already working on this since 19 before the pandemic, so it's actually worked out pretty well. There is some multiple choice. It's completely multiple choice. If you're familiar with the exam from years past, at one point there was a sort of an essay type question, case study. There was something written down word kind of answer, but it's all multiple choice now. There's no penalty for guessing. Some exams, because if you have, say, for example, 4 answer choices, theoretically you would have a 1/4 chance of getting that right. Some exams actually ding you a 1/4 penalty for a 1/4 point for a wrong question to kind of take away the guessing, but there's no penalty in this for guessing. We've expanded the test pool. People have been submitting questions. I've added a couple myself. Several people have added questions, so the test pool has expanded quite a bit. There's no need to have a proctor sit next to you. It's built-in automated. It's an AI proctoring. You can still get a paper exam, but there is a surcharge for handling all the paper. If you want to do the dead tree version, you got to pay a little more to account for that expense of printing and mailing. So it's a little bit more about the exams if you're not familiar with them. The passing score on both is 70% correct. The goal is for it to be hard enough so that about 70% of the test takers are able to pass. So the 70-70 rule, about 70% of the people should be able to get 70% correct. We have been doing some analysis of what people get right, what people get wrong. One of the nice things of having it online is you can take the data. It's all electronic. You can do some analysis on it. So Kevin Sankata, who is the exam principal that works with me on the board, he has looked at this and he's noticed some things that have a positive correlation with exam success, including previous exam attempts. So if you have taken an exam in the past and you did not pass, you didn't get your 70% correct, you should feel a little bit encouraged, because if you've taken the exam before, you're more likely to pass it on the subsequent attempt. If you have at least 3 years of cost estimating work experience, you're more likely to pass. If you use CBOC to study, you're more likely to pass. the amount of time you spend studying based on what people self-report in terms of the amount of time they spend studying. That is positively correlated with exam success. And if you have an employee-sponsored study group, that is a big factor in exam success. Okay, so that's kind of what we've been doing with the online exams. I think it definitely is a big step in the right direction to offer the exam online. One of the things that's hardest to do is with the exam is to the calculator, and so recommendation is to spend a little bit of time practicing with it. If you are using a laptop with a trackpad, the best way to do it is actually to plug in the keyboard and use the numpad as the number pad is a calculator. I like to use a trackpad on a laptop, and when I did some beta testing of the exam, and using the calculator with that setup is a little harder. So recommend that you do some sort of if you plug into a keyboard and use a numpad, it would definitely help. Another event that's kind of forced on us by the pandemic, then the online exam, we're going that direction anyway, but it was actually just sort of worked out well. The timing was right, and to offer the exam online during the pandemic worked out for us. But a thing that has negatively impacted us with the pandemic was last year the workshop was canceled. This year we're doing it online. It's May 17th through the 20th. We're going to have, at this particular workshop, we're having the keynote speakers, discussion panels, presentations, and some virtual networking. There's no training, unlike at the in-person workshops in the past. There's no training at this particular one. That will be a separate event, and we're doing some planning for that this week. Megan and Kelly Whiskey and I are working on doing some planning for that this week, and some others. There are discounted rates for attendance, so costs a lot less to attend the virtual event this year. And for more information, you should visit the website. So make sure you sign up for that. The last thing I want to talk about in this set of updates is the software cost estimating body of knowledge, the past, present, future. So we've done a lot of work on that. We're nearing getting close to completion of that. The expected rollout is early 2021. Not completely done yet, but we're getting there. The initial product would be a set of PowerPoint slides, just like historically the CBOC was in the set of PowerPoint slides. The new version of CBOC, which is still in beta, is in a wiki format on the SEO website. Actually, if you're looking at taking the exam, you should use the newer version, even though the exam is actually tied to the older version. But the newer version isn't, narrative format is much cleaner. Takes care of some of the idiosyncrasies of the previous versions. But the new SkiBoc will be in PowerPoint format, will be available for learning and instructing. We're preparing, once we have that, then we'll prepare a standalone specialty certification due later this year. And the eventual goal is to have an online narrative format body of knowledge. And then the target audiences for this are people in commercial organizations, OEMs, people that work for the government, consulting firms, quasi-government organizations, and academic institutions. So, the current cost estimating body of knowledge is largely DoD-centric. We're working on, broadening that a little bit with sort of national versions, and it's U.S.-centric as well. So people working on the board, Del Sherman particularly, is spearheading an effort to make national versions of CBOC, so a version for the UK, one for France, etc. SkiBoc is intended from the ground up not to be completely tied to DoD and not be DoD-centric or US-centric. So it's intended to appeal to commercial organizations, OEMs, the government organizations, consulting firms, quasi-government organizations, and academic institutions. And there really is no sort of standard for software cost estimating across, the industry writ large. There's within the DoD, there's courses at Defense Acquisition University, but there's no real sort of standard that's out there for software cost estimating. And so this is a real niche that ASEA can fill, is providing that standard for broad range of organizations. And then look at the goals where make sure it's not, like I said, make sure it's not US or DoD centric. Provide users with an understanding of software estimating. It complements, so this is not a standalone in the sense of if you don't know anything about cost estimating, you can go in and learn everything you need to know about software cost estimating. We're not, we didn't deliberately decide not to reinvent the wheel in terms of how do you normalize data, how do you apply inflation and escalation, how do you do risk analysis, how do you do regression analysis. That's all covered in CBOC. That SCIBOC is the things that are builds upon that, and what are the things that are unique about software cost estimating that you need to know about to do software cost estimates. It's not focused on one particular software sizing method. It's not it's not intended to be a proponent for function point as a software sizing method. It covers SLOC, the software lines of code. It covers function points, those kinds of things. So all the different methods. So it's tended to be agnostic, not promote one particular method. And basically to give you a guidance for all the central considerations in software cost estimating and get you started in terms of doing software cost estimating, both the development, estimating the development of the software, estimating the maintenance of software, and as well as what are the considerations you need to take into account when you buy off-the-shelf software and try to integrate that. What are the cost estimating considerations? So, like I said, it's gonna be a specialty version of CBOC. We're not repeating the fundamental estimating lessons in SCIBOC. It's basically only going to be able to purchase as an add-on to CBOC. So, and there are links between CBOC and SCIBOC back and forth. So you can't just buy SCIBOC. You also have to buy CBOC as well because the two are complementary. And then I'm just going to give you just so you have a flavor of what is what this would look like, and just a couple of things that a couple of sample charts from the SCIBOC and the draft charts. And this is a great selling point for learning about and learning SCIBOC is why is software cost estimating important. It's increasingly embedded in everything we do. I mean, there's even the roads you drive on, there's such a thing as smart roads now, where they're building in sensors into the roads to measure temperature and moisture and things like that. So you already see that on the roads with traffic cameras and computers that look and see and give you a ticket if you run a red light in certain places. There are 6 of those around the city where I live now. So there's software is an increasingly important part of all types of things. If you work in tanks, if you work in on aircraft, those kinds of things, an increasingly important part of those kinds of things, especially as we move towards autonomous things where there's no human directly operating, autonomous aircraft, autonomous tanks, those sorts of things. So it's a very important part of everything that we do. There's an example of one of the charts from the draft SCIBOC, and then here's another that talks about we don't reinvent the wheel. Everything is SCIBOC, but we do cover a couple of things on risk, and so why cost and schedule growth occur, which is this chart is taken from a presentation I gave about my book. So there is that. All right, so I think that's it for the initiatives. So like Megan said, if you have any questions, please hold them and we'll go over them at the end. The next thing we want to discuss is we offer training every spring. Okay, exit. Okay. And Teresa, if you want to talk about this?
Hey, we're again offering our spring training this year, as Christian had said earlier, and it will be virtual this year. We're offering the same 7 sessions that we have in the past, or 7 classes, and it will be your introduction, the risk and software estimating, the contract pricing, learning curve, economics and statistics, earned value management, as well as the inflation and indices. We don't have dates picked out, like I said, yet, but we're still working with our instructors and trying to get all that picked out. And there's the registration information down here for if you want to apply to take the exam. And then there's also the link if you want to look at the questions to see what the information about the exam and the certification. Next chart, please. And this just shows you the different sessions that we will be having, and then who the instructors are. And we'll be sending out additional information later when we actually get the dates and the times set up. But the classes will run approximately 2 hours. So that's all we've got so far, but we'll be getting back with you when we get a little bit more things solidified.
Yes, and then I guess once we have the dates set up, one of the traditionally we've had this offered this class like from 5 to 7 in the evenings. Now that we're doing it virtually, depending on people's situations, that may or may not be an ideal time. So we'd like people, I guess once we sign up, would like your feedback and figure out the best times, whether you would like to have it after working hours, you want to continue the 5 to 7 time frame, or I know that now that you're doing this from home, it's all virtual. If your kids are, school during the day, and you could potentially take the time out of your work day to do this, would that be better versus trying to do it in the evening when your kids are at home from school, or does that matter for you? So that's one of the things we'd like to work with the people that sign up for the class. When is the best time for everyone? Also depends on the best times for instructors as well. But okay, anything else, Teresa? On that?
I think that about covered it.
Okay, I think this is a great service that our chapter has offered over the years. It's how I prepared for the exam back in the day. It's a little bit of a homegrown. The instructors that take it have all been certified or are certified, so they've gone through the experience, and so they know what it takes to pass the exam. So they can. It's pretty hands-on, pretty practical. So this was my primary means of preparing for the exam. Was attending these sessions, so it's pretty practical. They don't necessarily teach to the exam, but they teach you the exact material that you need to learn in order to be prepared for the exam. You should still use CBOC, but this definitely is a big aid. So so with that, I'll turn over. I'm going to give a relatively short presentation, I think, on risk management for irregular or what people call rare events. How do you handle unknown unknowns, black swans, and other rare hazards? A little bit about me. I'm the chief scientist with Calibrate Federal. I have a new book out on risk management that was published in November 2020. I used to be the cost director for the Missile Defense Agency, and I've been doing cost analysis and related activities for about 20 years. And there's my contact information below. If you have if you're interested in serving on the Greater Alabama Board and want to run for a position, use that address, let me know. Or if you have other questions about the chapter or what's going on at ASEA nationally, or you wanted to contact me about the presentation or want to discuss other things, feel free to contact me right at csmart@galrath.com. Okay, so a little bit of background on just risk. Risk, there's 2 dimensions of risk typically. Some people add another one, but we'll focus on these 2. Is the likelihood of occurrence and the extent of damages or consequence. Dimension 1 is how likely is the risk to occur. That's the frequency. For example, things that are frequent: cost growth and schedule delays in defense programs and NASA programs and other types of projects. Pretty much any type of project. Things that aren't so frequent: catastrophic failures of major systems. For example, the space shuttle had 2 catastrophic failures out of 150 flights. Things that are really rare are extreme cost growth, things that grow 1,000% or more. Pandemics are rare. If you think about, in terms of pandemics that kill a large number of people. So if you think about pandemics that have resulted in 1,000, more than 1 million deaths, you typically would think about the current pandemic with COVID-19. And then in terms of things like an infectious disease that spreads through aerosol transmission, you would have to go back to, the Spanish flu 100, around 100 years ago. There are some other epidemics that have killed a lot of people over time. HIV is one of those. It's killed more than 20 million people. Wars, wars that kill a large number of people are very rare. Wars that kill millions of people are relatively rare. Luckily, we haven't had one of those in a while. The other dimension of risk is consequence, and I kind of talked about that a little bit in terms of the impact of risk. Low consequence, minor technical problem that shuts down a system for a day. High consequence is a large number of deaths due to a pandemic, a significant schedule delay that prevents fielding a critical system for years, things like that. We have an innate tendency to focus on frequency. Tendency to focus on, but it's focused on likelihood. I got this backwards in this chart, but the overall tendency is focused on likelihood rather than consequence. But consequence is more important than likelihood. Just an example, Pascal's wager was a thought experiment by the French mathematician and mystic Blaise Pascal. He argued a rational person should bet on God because if you believe in God and he does exist, there's a lot of upside. There's no downside. But if you don't believe in God, there is, you believe he does not exist, there's not a lot of upside to that, but there's a lot of downside. So another example of that, more recent example is Dirty Harry in the film Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood's character, Dirty Harry. He corners a bank robber after confronting some bank robbers having a shootout in a bank. There's one bank robber left, and he's confronting him. He's pointing his gun at him. He says, "I know you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. Did he fire 6 shots or only 5?" Well, to tell you the truth, in all this excitement, I've kind of lost track myself. But this is a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world, and would blow your head clean off. You've got to ask yourself one question: do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? So the gunman, regardless of the likelihood, the gunman focused on the consequence, which Dirty Harry really made plain to him about blowing his head off. He focused on the consequence and he surrendered. And we never found. I don't know if we ever found out Dirty Harry had a bullet in that gun or not. But that's clearly the importance between. It may or may not have been very likely that Dirty Harry had a bullet in the gun left, but the consequence was very important, and that's what we need to focus on. Despite its importance, consequence is underweighted. There's an innate bias to be right. Behavioral economists tend to focus on something called probability neglect. People worry about events that aren't very likely to occur, but these are events that have extreme consequences. So you should worry about things like terrorism and pandemics. They're not very likely to occur, but when they do, it can have very large consequences. Okay, let's see. I'm going to talk just a little bit about types of randomness that you can experience. Things that you would, if you take statistics 101, you will see things that are largely mild or symmetric risk, mild and symmetric. Mild variation, the sum of numerous independent random variables. The central limit theorem prevails in that case. The normal distribution, which I refer to as a Gaussian, is often referred to as a Gaussian. So I prefer to call it the Gaussian because in the work that I do, the normal is usually not so normal. Examples of mild risks are health insurance, some maintenance costs, lifespan of humans, heights of people, heights of all sorts of things. But then, within a species, the variation in height is a pretty mild variation. And then you get into the mild to wild and the asymmetric types of risks. You have mild to wild variation, but it's not symmetric. You can't really model it with Gaussian because a good example of that is cost analysis with cost uncertainty, schedule uncertainty to a large extent. It's this way. There's a lot more that can go wrong than go right. So it's definitely skewed. So that's one thing. The risk can be relatively mild. It can also be pretty wild. You can model these types of risks with log normal distribution or exponential distributions in the case of you're doing reliability modeling and failure modeling. Some examples are, like I said, cost and schedule risks, and parts reliability often follow an exponential distribution. Wild risks are ones that really extreme. You don't typically portray them graphically as a distribution, just because the big focus is in the tail, and you have this you have a log scale y-axis and long scale x-axis, and they follow this sort of power law down here. And we'll give some examples of phenomena that follow those. When you get really wild risk, you get areas where we have infinite means and infinite variances. Now, we live in a finite world, so you're never going to have an infinite number of deaths due to a pandemic. But when you model it and you look at what the distribution parameters are, it's such a it's to the extent that it's really basically what it means in all practical sense, that those are not well defined. There is no population mean. There is no underlying population variance. It's so extreme. There's no typical member of the population. And deaths from pandemics, destructions from terrorist attacks, the financial impacts of hurricanes, film revenues. Another phenomenon that follows this that's been in the news recently is the number of people affected by a power outage. So what's happened in Texas, with 3 million people experienced power outages. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I've actually prepared a chart specifically on that yesterday to kind of bring into this discussion. And then there are some risks that you just, and some uncertainty that you really just can't handle at all. There's some problems that you can't model well at all. And who, for example, saw 20 years ago that we'd all have smartphones now? Things like that, things that we just never could foresee coming. These are true black swans that come out of nowhere. Both, they could be positive and negative. The advent of a smartphone, to a large extent, is pretty positive. Economists tend to focus on the intractable risk, and there's a recent book, Radical Uncertainty, that tries to argue that almost everything that you look at in terms of actual events in the real world are intractable in the sense that they're uncertain in the sense that there's some vagueness about their outcome. You can't really model it. That's not really true. There are some things you cannot model, but there's a lot of things you can. And so whether they're mild risks or they're between mild and wild, or they're wild, whether they're symmetric or asymmetric, there's a lot of different tools. And so I'm going to talk in this presentation about some different wild risks and some different rare events and different ways that they can be modeled. Okay, so the three ways, I'm about 3 different ways to handle rare high impact events. There are some events that cannot effectively, there's effective methods for modeling a lot of rare events. So there's unknown unknowns and resource risk, what Don Rumsfeld called the unknown unknowns. And this, for example, is cost and schedule growth. Historically, cost and schedule growth closely follow 3-parameter log normal distribution. That's a log normal distribution that also has an extra parameter to shift the location to basically in this case, to the right. You can use this to model the occurrence of extreme resource risk. For events where that are really wild in nature, like pandemics, you can use extreme value theory to model. Also, the number of people affected by a power outage. The focus in these cases is tail behavior. How bad can it get versus estimating a most likely or mean value. And then there's an emerging science that's been going on for a long, probably 20, 30 years. It's been increasingly becoming well developed, is the science of why. In a lot of statistical analysis, we focus on correlations. If you do a regression analysis, you're looking at what's correlated. If you're doing cost analysis and you're trying to develop a regression model to predict cost, you're saying what's correlated with the cost. But there's underlying science of things what is the causation? Just because 2 things are correlated doesn't mean that one causes the other. For example, ice cream sales at the beach and shark attacks. They're correlated, but one does not cause the other. It's because there's an underlying causation, which is warm weather. Warm weather arrives, more people go to the beach, and more people are at the beach, more people are attacked by sharks. So, but it's emerging science for this. We'll talk a little about that. It's even better for extreme and rare events for which there's little historical precedence. It's understand the underlying root causes, and there are ways to mathematically model that. One way to do that is something called a Bayesian belief network. So first talk about the 3-parameter log normal resource risk. So if you look at resource risk, we don't typically historically as a profession do a good job of estimating risk for cost or for schedule realistically. We tend to be far too narrow. So here's an example of a risk analysis that was done in the 1980s. And here is the initial budget is the vertical line on the left. And there were two risk analyses that were done, one in May of 1981 and then one in March of 82. And you can see that these are pretty tight ranges. You look at, you call these S curves, but it's pretty, very steep S. It's way below the actual final cost. So the risks that were there were not even on the actual cost was not even on the initial S curve, far below. So that's just an example. And so if you actually look at some data, and we don't tend to, one of the issues we don't, as a profession, we don't tend to track how we've done in terms of risk analysis. So if we were to, for example, in this case, I went and did some forensic analysis. I looked at 10 past projects. A couple of them I had worked on. 10 past projects, I looked at what the 90% confidence level. So if the 90th percentile of the S curve, in which case, 9 times out of 10, the actual should have been at or below that amount. But you look at this in this sample of 10 missions, that was only true for 2 of them, and only one of them was actually below the 90th. There was another one that was actually at the 90th percentile. It's that kind of an analysis for the tethered satellite system, the TSS. It was not anomalous. It was actually pretty standard. And that's it's the exact opposite of what you expect. You expect the opposite to be the case. So if these 90% confidence levels were actually truly measuring the 90th percentile, if that were the case, the chance of this occurring where only 1 is strictly below the 90th percent confidence level and only 2 are at or below the 90% confidence level, it's like less than, the chance of that occurring randomly is less than 1 in a million. So you're more likely to be struck by lightning than for this to occur. If it's the case that these are realistic risk ranges, which indicates they're not, right? That's the outcome of this. So we don't do a necessarily good job of that. So we need to do a better job of that. One of the reasons why we tend to underestimate risk, and when we look at that, we don't take into account unknown unknowns into our risk analysis. There are a lot of things that are external to the program, the things we don't know that we don't know. Black Swan is kind of an example, an extreme example of an unknown unknown. Before the discovery of black swans in Australia, it was assumed all swans are white. So it's come to mean an improbable event that has a significant consequence, either good or bad. Similar to the concept of unknown unknowns, but it puts a big emphasis on the consequence. However, we can still model these because we look at the historical track record and they capture a lot of it. As Norman Augustine wrote in his timeless classic, Augustine's Laws, unknown unknowns cannot be specified in advance, but their existence in the aggregate can be predicted with every bit as much confidence as insurance companies place in actuarial statistics. We can't capture everything, but we can capture a lot of it by looking at historical cost and schedule growth. It's a consistent pattern over time. It's a common problem. It occurs in all types of industries. My background is in aerospace and defense. When I was working with McGraw-Hill to publish my book, one of the conditions they gave me was, well, we think aerospace and defense is too narrow. We want you to, if you can broaden it to all projects, we can, we'll publish your book. So I did a little bit of digging and found that, yeah, it pretty much was the case that it occurs across all types of projects. It occurs in the Olympics, it occurs in software, it occurs in roads, bridges, tunnels. An Oxford professor named Ben Fluberg has done a lot of research on cost growth for bridges, tunnels, and roads and rail systems. So this, this pretty consistent pattern over time. Roads, as you might expect, roads are a little simpler than some more complex systems. So their average cost growth is a little bit later, a little bit less than other industries, but it's still very prevalent and occurs most of the time. So across industries, 8 out of 10, at least 8 out of 10, regardless of industry, at least 8 out of 10 missions experience some cost growth. Most of them, schedule delays are just as common. 7 out of 10 projects or more experience schedule delays. The only one exception to that is the Olympics. And this is before the pandemic. So the 2020 Olympics actually experienced a schedule delay because of the pandemic. So, but previously they had not experiencing delays because they set a fixed date years in advance, and they try very hard not to deviate from it. And as a result, partly as a result of that, trying to work to a fixed schedule, there's no flexibility in the schedule. Their average cost growth is the highest of any type of project. But it's just a very consistent pattern you see over time. It has not gotten better. Bent Fluberg's database goes back 100 years, and he sees no change in the consistency of no pattern. And is it getting more prevalent, less prevalent? Sees it's happening about the same. NASA projects grow on average by 50%. There's older studies that show that. I did a study in 2010 on NASA and aerospace, showed 50%. Norm Augustine's book is 50%. Andy Prince did a study a few years ago that average cost growth for NASA projects is 50%. So it seems like it's pretty consistent over time. If you work in NASA and DoDs, you see this happen over and over again. You think, well, we're some of the worst. No, we're actually kind of middle of the road. But the big thing, and the thing that really makes it hard for us to get our hands around in terms of risk, is the amount of extreme risk. Basically, 1 in 6 projects double or more for DoD and NASA. Development programs, more than 6 DoD development programs more than doubles in cost. I would lump NASA in with that. And about 5% more than triple in cost. You don't see the same extent in terms of percentage changes. You don't see the same percent of extremes in terms of schedule growth. It's pretty consistent for it to happen, but it doesn't seem to be quite as extreme. Okay. The answer to dealing with this is to calibrate history. So just get your hands around it. Is cost growth and schedule delays are instances of the realizations of risk. So if you calibrate to historical growth data, it provides a mean to realistically assess risk. So there's 2 charts here. One is cost growth data. There is the dashed line, and it's almost hard to read the dashed line because the log normal fits it so closely. This is a 3-parameter log normal, and then a normal distribution is the other dashed line. It doesn't fit so well. You can see that doesn't fit so well. And then same thing holds true for schedule. The 3-parameter log normal doesn't. It's still a very good fit and would pass any kind of statistical test. It's just not quite as completely coincident as it is with the cost growth data. So you can model this pretty well and pretty realistically with a 3-parameter log normal. And this allows you to you can do the analysis. You can do a risk analysis from the ground up and then compare it to these results and see if they're realistic. Or you can use this actually as a method on its own. I use this pretty regularly for projects that don't have the time or the resources to do a full up risk analysis. So this is the 3-parameter log normal. Just a little bit about the 3-parameter log normal. It's basically the same as a log normal, but it's just shifted. The reason why you would use a 3-parameter log normal is once a project starts, a log normal would say you could go down to 0. Now, it's not very likely you're going to get down to 0, but you could get to very low levels with some relatively high probability. And that's not realistic. You're not going to be able to cut 90% of the cost out and still deliver the same program. So this takes into account that phenomenon that there's some amount of limited downside variation, mean, variance, and location. And I've developed a tool, an standalone Excel tool that will do this analysis for you. You can calibrate to based on what you think your estimate's based on. You can calibrate it as a percentile. You can calibrate it as the mean or the median, or you can also, there's a phenomenon known as MAMES, which is once you allocate a certain amount of money to a project, you're going to spend that much or more. It may go up from there. So I have an standalone Excel tool that will do that. You can also do this with, if you want to put ranges around your cost estimate, tolerance ranges, you can also calibrate to that. So if you're interested in that, you can contact me. I can provide you that spreadsheet. It's just a simple spreadsheet that will allow you to do that. And if you want to learn more about that, I talk about this quite a bit in my book. It's published 2020 by McGraw-Hill. It's I know that I'm known in the community for a lot of technical presentations with a lot of equations, but I deliberately wrote this in plain language. There are really no equations in the book. Some simple numerical examples, but there's no equations in the book, no formulas. It's all demonstrated with words and then illustrated a lot with graphs. I have 90 tables and figures to illustrate the concepts, but it's pretty down to earth and relatively easy. People tell me it's easy to read. Try to make it easy to read, and I highlight the problem of risk and talk about what a lot of the issues are and how to improve the practice of risk management. So you can find it on Amazon. It retails for $60, but you can get on Amazon for less than $40. There's a Kindle version. If you're a Nook user, there's also a Nook version available through Barnes & Noble. Okay, and then the next topic I want to talk about, the last topic I want to talk about is extreme value theory. Not all problems involve estimating a best value, but that's what we tend to look at. We tend to think about what is the most likely occurrence. As Abraham Maslow said, though, I suppose it's tempting if the only tool you have as a hammer is to treat everything as if it were a nail. But there's some problems that don't involve that, so you have to have a different tool set. So some problems that don't involve estimating a best value: how high should you build a dike to prevent a flood? What's the likelihood of an athlete establishing a new record? That's not an average, that's a maximum. How many people will die from a pandemic? You say, okay, well, what do you expect? Now, the problem with the pandemic, number of deaths from a pandemic, is there is no, because of this, it's a wild risk, there is no most likely value. If you look at history, for example, when you go back to recorded, the beginning of recorded history, probably one of the worst plagues to strike the world was the plague of Justinian, which occurred in the Roman Empire, and it wiped out about a third of the world's known population at the time, which in today's population, if it were affect the entire world, could mean billions of deaths. So you really talk about extreme risk with some of these types of things. So really, when you look at how many people are likely to die with a pandemic, you're looking at extremes. There's not really there's no good average. There's no good average member of a set like that. So you need a different tool set to solve. You're looking at, instead of looking at an average, you're looking at a maximum, right? A maximum or a minimum. Sum of independent and identically distributed random variables converge to a Gaussian distribution. That's the central limit theorem, but a lot of issues with this in practical settings, especially estimating the cost of weapon systems and aerospace systems. For extreme value theory, you look at what did the extremes converge to, and they converge to this type of family of distributions, which is the equation I give here below. And you can model that with these, depending upon how wild the risks are, is basically which one of these it would follow. Example with the flooding, you don't build flood prevention measures to averages, but to extremes. The Netherlands, they plan their dike systems for 1 in 1,000 years events. So if the Netherlands were to not have dikes, most of the country would be underwater. So even with the dikes, if they plan for average floods, most of the country would be underwater. But by planning for extremes and building to higher levels, they are able to reclaim a lot of that low-lying territory as actual land rather than sea land. And like I said, the mean is not meaningful in all circumstances. Where we talk about the normal distribution is in traditional statistics. You take Statistics 101, you look at the normal distribution a lot, and those are things that are designed for limited variation. What Nassim Taleb calls extremist stand, there's many events that extreme fluctuations. Point estimates are not typical. There's no population mean. So extreme value theory looks at the tail. So that makes it a good tool for this. And then a current extreme event is pandemics. You look at threshold exceedances. So a generalized Pareto distribution applies. So standard methods look at that. There's been a study done of pandemic data, Pascual, Cirillo, and Nassim Taleb. They did a study in 2020. It's 71 data points with they looked at pandemics with at least 1,000 deaths. The sources now, all the talk about all the good and the bad of this. Their source is a Wikipedia article, not the most necessarily authoritative source, but it is one interesting look at the data. They adjusted. So I took their data just for world population, which they didn't do an initial study. And if you do that and you plot this, you get this extreme. So there's a couple over here with more than 1 billion. I think one of the instances of the Black Death, the plague in the Middle Ages, was one of these, and the other one's the plague of Justinian. Where do we fall with COVID is, right here at the beginning of this tail. It's actually in the low millions down here. So this is the tail. So we're kind of, even with all our modern advances in medical science, it's, we're still experiencing an event that is in the relative tail. As of early December, it was close to the tail. Now, since the number of deaths has gone up quite a bit, we're kind of at the low end of the tail here, and it's actually on this. It's not actually on this curve. But I plot this curve, it'd be way up here at the very end of the tail. One question is, is it a black swan? One debate people had online a while back was, it did have a high impact, but was it improbable? So, a black swan is a high impact event that's not likely. So it does have a high consequence, not only in terms of deaths, but also economic impact. But was it improbable? If you go back and look at what Nassim Taleb wrote in The Black Swan, which was initially published in 2007, he stated the history of epidemics does not suggest the risk of the Great Plague that will dominate the planet. He specifically mentions global travel as a means for spread, which has increased significantly over the last 20 years as many people in the US have been traveling globally for a while, but you're seeing an emergence of a tourist class in China, for example, as that country has experienced significant economic growth, as becoming the largest economy in the world. There's a lot of people in China, and that's where the plague is, the current plague, the COVID-19 epidemic is believed to originated. And Laurie Garrett, who's a specialist in infectious diseases, she wrote in her book, The Coming Plague, published in 2000, that humanity becomes increasingly vulnerable to epidemics over time, despite advances in science and medicine. And she mentions global travel as a vector for that. So, conclusion, even though some people highlight this as a potential risk, how many of us really started 2020 with any concept that such a thing would happen last year? This is now last year that she wrote that chart in 2020. Not me, not many. I was not one of them. I didn't think it was going to happen. And here's another example that I just put together yesterday. I just actually stole this chart from Walter Willinger, who wrote a paper on and gave a presentation on this subject. So available through the internet. Quick internet search will help you find it. Large power outages happen pretty regularly. They're not, what happened in Texas is not likely, but it's not unheard of. It's actually less than and what's listed there was a example that highlights the power outage in 2003, the Great Northeast Blackout 2003, which affected 55 million people. You may not have, I don't really remember it being, being that prominent, and probably wasn't, and is not, because it occurred in the summer, it occurred in August. So the effects were not as damaging. People didn't freeze to death in August. And most people had their power back on in a couple hours. It did linger for some time after that, but also Texas had a similar outage in 2011. It was not as extreme, but it was pretty big outage. The weather, only the freezing temperatures were quite as extreme, so it wasn't as bad. These kinds of things are more likely to occur in the future as climate change. One of the things that happened with Texas is the polar vortex shifted south, and that caused the freezing temperatures throughout every county in Texas. That's not very likely. In the past, not very likely to happen. With climate change, one of the things is that polar vortex is becoming less stable over time, and that makes an extreme event like that more likely to happen. So Texas did not really learn from its lessons in 2011. There was a study that was done and a report published in 2012 that made several recommendations, but they did not, the state did not take them to heart. And those power outages kind of basically follow a power law. It's shown on the right. So they really kind of didn't. And one of the issues is, they planned for the best case. They didn't plan for the most likely case or the worst case. They planned for the best case, and that's a common psychological phenomenon known as the planning fallacy that the psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky noted. Okay, one other way to handle extreme events is something called Bayesian decision networks. Like I mentioned, correlation is the tendency of two random variables to move together. Causation, a causal framework can help with risk management. It's relatively new, it's an emerging field. Judeo Pearl, who won a Turing Award, which is kind of like the Nobel Prize of computer science. He's won a Turing Award for his work in this area. Others have been instrumental in developing these methods. A lot of these methods involve Bayesian techniques, which allows mixing judgment data. One of the great things about this type of technique is if something has never occurred before, we have no historical data on, but with using intuition and expert judgment and experience with other types of risks, you can make some assessment of what the risk might be, and then that'll allow you to quantify these things. Bayes' rule, Thomas Bayes, he invented the equation that bears his name. He invented it in the 18th century England. It's basically basically a formula that expresses the idea of conditional probability. It gives you an analytical framework for combining experience and data. It's been used in a lot of settings, insurance premiums, search and find, genetics testing, code breaking, etc. A lot of the advances that made it more computationally tractable happened since the 1990s, though. And then I'm going to end on talking about the science of causality. A variety of tools have been developed over the last 100 years. I've done a little bit of work with some folks at Carnegie Mellon at the Software Engineering Institute on a project, and they've done some work on this. It actually originally dates back to the 20s and 30s. The Sewell-Wright path model and structural equation modeling emerged 100 years ago, and structural equation modeling is still in use. The more recent work is the Bayesian networks. And the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon, they're at the forefront. There's an open source tool that they are involved in developing and maintaining. And there's a link there at CMU. This is where it was originally hosted. I think that link has changed recently, but if you look for Tetrad and you look for Carnegie Mellon, you can find where it is. It's an open source tool. It's in JavaScript, and you can download it. It's basically freeware. You can use it. It's ideal for rare events. Like I said, it allows ways to use your experience, your a priori knowledge coming in, allows you to mix judgment with data. And here's an example of a project that the folks at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon did, and they presented this at the 2018 ICEA conference. What are the factors that determine software project success? So you see these arrows here that kind of quality suffers if you have unclear goals, if you have missed or late decisions, that causes quality to suffer. Quality, and that also impacts things in between. So missed or late decisions impact and results in requirements not being analyzed, which causes quality to suffer. And so what the tools will do and the math will tease out is the causality arrow. So sometimes they point in one direction, sometimes the causality can point in multiple directions, but these are the things, unclear goals, lack of consensus impacts, non-compliance with processes, stress or overtime. And if you look at the data will kind of wind up pointing an arrow in one direction or sometimes both directions. But you can see what some of the things are that contribute in a causal sense to the quality of a software project, which it really causes the quality to suffer in this case. And then there again is just some references. So that's pretty much all that I have. And so I guess we have a little bit of time left for questions.
We do, but we don't have any questions to fill it. I think you've
okay.
wowed them. So if you want to say any closing remarks, give,
So the things I like to close with are we have we are going to have an election for the ICEA board. If you're interested, please contact me. The csmart@gallowrath.com. I'll put this back to that chart so you can see my email address. And that's one thing. And then also we're going to be doing the certification prep training that we do every spring. It's free. Just need to go onto the ICO website and sign up for that. We'll be virtual this year, so that's going to be a little bit different. And so once we have critical mass of signups and attendees, we'll figure out what time is best for everyone to do that, because things are a little different this year. We used to have it from 5 to 7, but now we don't know if that's the best time for everyone or not. So we'll work that out. So those are the two key things we have coming up as a chapter, and we'll be planning some more chapter events, probably virtually for the time being. One thing that may be on our radar screen is looking at in the past we've done the annual workshop. 2020 was the first time that we had not done that since we started doing it in 2008. So we'll going to try to do that again. Maybe it may be involved doing virtual. Also, remember May 17th through 20th. That's the ICEA virtual workshop, the ICEA National Virtual Workshop. So keep that in mind as well.
Outstanding. Thank you, Dr. Smart. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, and stay safe and sane out there. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks.